I had such a lot of support from friends that had been there since I was 17 and are still there now.
Picture this. It's February 1967. A chilly night in Redlands, Keith Richards' Sussex country home. A supposed quiet weekend of friends, music, and conversation turned into one of the most scandalous nights in rock history. Blue lights flashed, doors were kicked open, and headlines exploded the next morning. Rolling Stones in drug bust. But there was always something fishy, something hidden beneath the haze of LSD and scandalous tabloid rumors. For decades, fans speculated, theories swirled. Who tipped off the cops? What really happened that night at Redlands? And most importantly, was Marianne Faithfull truly just an innocent bystander wrapped in a fur rug, or was she part of something far more orchestrated? Now, after years of silence, Marianne Faithfull has spoken, and what she revealed changes everything. What happened that night in Redlands wasn't just a chaotic accident. It was the beginning of a story no one dared to finish, until now. To understand it, we need to go back to the very start, when rebellion, celebrity, and paranoia collided in one isolated house in Sussex. At the time, the Rolling Stones were on top of the world. Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Brian Jones. They weren't just pop stars, they were the poster boys of British rebellion. But with fame came surveillance, and by 1967, the establishment wanted blood. Redlands was supposed to be a safe haven. That February weekend, Keith invited a few close friends, including Mick and Marianne Faithfull, to escape the city. But it wasn't just a friendly gathering, it was a psychedelic escape, filled with hash, LSD, and blurred boundaries. When police stormed in, the tabloid press had a field day. The infamous detail that haunted them for years? Marianne Faithfull, allegedly found naked under a fur rug with a Mars bar, an image forever tied to the Stones' outlaw mythology. But as time went on, insiders began whispering. The story didn't add up. But while the press ran wild with scandalous headlines, the real truth stayed buried. Until Marianne Faithfull finally found the courage to speak. What she revealed cast a whole new light on that infamous night. Faithfull didn't just revisit old memories, she solved the very mystery that haunted rock history for decades. For the first time, the missing puzzle piece of the Redlands drug bust snapped into place. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't chaos, it was betrayal. And Marianne was the only one brave enough to say it out loud. In her own words, Faithfull revealed that the night was never meant to be a random bust. It had been planned, orchestrated with chilling precision, and the people behind it were far closer than anyone could have imagined.
Nobody really knew what damage could be done by taking too many drugs, by touring too hard, by working.
She revealed that the police were tipped off intentionally by someone within the Stones' own inner circle, someone driven by jealousy or a thirst for revenge. She described secret meetings, rising tensions, and an atmosphere thick with paranoia. The betrayal had begun from within. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. Someone had set them up, and the betrayal didn't come from outside forces. It came from within. Faithfull's revelations reopened old wounds. Mick and Keith had long assumed the media were tipped off by Scotland Yard to set an example, but the real story was even darker. Many now believe that Brian Jones, increasingly unstable and alienated from the band, might have played a role in the betrayal. At the time, his mental health and drug problems were escalating, and his jealousy toward Mick and Keith, particularly over Marianne, was festering. Faithfull recalled the early signs of division within the group: ego, drugs, mistrust, all building toward a fracture that exploded that night in Redlands. From that point on, the band's unity was forever compromised. All signs seemed to point toward one man, fragile, brilliant, and unraveling from the inside. That man was Brian Jones. Brian was a genius, a founding member, and a visionary. But by 1967, he was also deeply broken. Struggling with insecurity, drug dependency, and his rapidly shrinking role in the band, Brian began lashing out. Observers suggest his jealousy became unbearable. Seeing Mick and Keith dominate the spotlight while his own influence waned was more than he could stand. His relationship with Anita Pallenberg was crumbling, and Marianne's growing presence only added to the emotional chaos. According to Faithfull, Brian may have spoken to the wrong person or even acted out of desperation, hoping to bring the entire Stones empire down. But the fallout didn't stop there. As suspicion spread, even the bond between Mick and Keith began to crack, revealing the fragile brotherhood beneath the surface. The Redlands bust didn't just expose the Stones to the law, it exposed fractures that would haunt the band for decades. Faithfull made it clear that trust between Mick and Keith began to break almost immediately. Mick placed the blame on Keith for allowing too many people to attend. Keith, in turn, felt Mick hadn't defended Marianne when it mattered. Suspicion festered on both sides. What once seemed like an unbreakable partnership slowly began to splinter. Redlands wasn't just a raid, it was the start of a cold war between two giants of rock. And just as the band began tearing at the seams, the establishment struck, dragging the Stones into court in a very public attempt to crush them once and for all. After the bust, the British legal system didn't hesitate to strike. Mick and Keith were thrust into courtrooms, facing prison terms and national shame. The media delighted in exposing every detail. Conservative voices demanded strict punishment, and as the only woman involved, Marianne became a lightning rod for moral outrage. It wasn't just about drugs. It was a statement, a warning, a deliberate attack on the youth movement the Stones represented. But no one bore the brunt of that night more than Marianne. What followed for her wasn't just public shame, it was a descent into darkness few could have survived. The aftermath wasn't just devastating for Faithfull, it was annihilating. Practically overnight, she went from being a rising star and poetic muse to the symbol of scandalous ruin. She was no longer Marianne the artist, the voice, the presence on stage. She was reduced to a salacious headline, forever remembered as the woman under the fur rug. Her name became a joke in newspapers, her face a target for shame. The Mars Bar story, fabricated, humiliating, and cruel, was not only believed by millions, it was etched into the culture like gospel, drowning out everything she had ever created or achieved. Worse than the lies were the betrayals. Those closest to her, the same people who had once drawn strength from her presence, vanished. They didn't defend her, they didn't question the narrative, they let her fall. Isolated and stripped of her dignity, Marianne turned inward. Her descent into heroin was not glamorous nor rebellious. It was an act of emotional survival, a desperate attempt to disappear, to numb the relentless noise of public ridicule and internal despair. Her world shrank to silence and shadows. Gone were the stages, the adoring fans, the laughter in hotel hallways. In their place, needles, withdrawal, and haunting loneliness. The world moved on. The Rolling Stones became legends, but Marianne was left behind like collateral damage, forgotten, misunderstood, and bearing the full, crushing weight of their rebellion. As the dust settled, the world looked different. The Stones were no longer cheeky rebels, they were outlaws. And Marianne? She became something else entirely. Redlands marked a turning point, one that shattered the illusion of unity and freedom that had surrounded the Rolling Stones. In the eyes of the public, their image began to mutate. They were no longer mischievous rebels making headlines, they were dangerous, corrupted icons of a movement the establishment was desperate to suppress. The glamour faded, and in its place, a darker mythology took root. The drugs escalated, the laughter dimmed, the trust that once bonded them unraveled quietly behind the scenes. For Marianne Faithfull, the consequences were even more devastating. Her reputation was not only tarnished, it was dismantled piece by piece. Once hailed as a poetic voice and mysterious muse, she became a caricature crafted by tabloids. She was reduced to a punchline, her identity swallowed by one cruel manufactured lie, the Mars Bar story. Despite her repeated denials, it shadowed her for decades, growing like a tumor on her legacy. As the world ridiculed her, she slipped deeper into despair. Fame turned its back, friends faded away. Left alone to carry the weight of public shame, she plunged into addiction, using heroin not to chase pleasure, but to silence the noise. She vanished from stages and spotlights, not because she wanted to, but because the world had turned her into a symbol of failure. And while the Stones marched on, draped in defiance and controversy, Marianne quietly fought a brutal, invisible war with herself. Only decades later would the truth start to emerge, not from a courtroom or a journalist, but from Marianne herself. Looking back now, Marianne Faithfull doesn't speak with bitterness or vengeance. Instead, she sees the past with a startling and painful clarity. Those years, once painted in bright psychedelic rebellion and creative fire, now appear to her as something else entirely. A carefully crafted illusion masking the reality of manipulation, surveillance, and betrayal. She remembers the way they all believed they were cultural revolutionaries, shaking the foundations of the establishment. But in truth, they were already under the microscope, their every move calculated not just by fans or the press, but by those in power. They were being managed, played, and ultimately punished. The Redlands bust wasn't just a headline, it was a trap. And she now understands that everything that followed was part of a much larger strategy to break not just the Rolling Stones, but the counterculture they symbolized. Her personal trauma, the shaming, the addiction, it all began with that moment. That night didn't just mark the end of innocence. It marked the beginning of decades of internal exile. Now, as she tells her story, Marianne isn't simply recounting history, she's rewriting it from the inside, reclaiming her voice and placing herself not as a side character in someone else's myth, but as a witness to a hidden war. The fur rug, the Mars bar, the humiliation, those were never her truth. Her truth was buried beneath decades of silence, shame, and media lies. And now, with fire in her voice and clarity in her eyes, she has unearthed it at last.